We are recording. Y'all had 3 points of conversation, discussion topics or inquiries. Um, the first one, shit, I forgot. The first one, what have African people lost by moving away from the community-owned definition of manhood? Based on the reading's articulation of manhood and masculinity, can they be applied to today's society? And then 3, what new understandings did you gain? New understandings of manhood did you gain based on the reading? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout room? Tanaya, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Um, I'll be going more into the second and third question.
Okay.
So, based on the reading, there were definitely some aspects that we thought could be implemented in today's society, such as praising the birth of your child and celebrating the life of your sons and letting them know their importance in the community, wanting your son to be strong, wanting your son to be knowledgeable, and things of that nature. But going into the third question, what new understandings of manhood? Um, the contribution of women is one thing that we covered because it's not nowadays, that's actually like taboo. They're telling women like you have no place telling a man how to be a man. That's what a lot of these podcasts are telling younger men, saying women have no place telling you how to be you. And even when I was growing up, my dad used to tell me, he was like, you will never be a man. You can't tell a man how to be a man. You need to know how to be a woman. And even in some instances, some men will try and like teach women how to be women, but there is no, you can't flip it. And then another aspect that we were talking about is some principles of manhood haven't evolved. There are still, you're still being taught strength, which is good, but it can be good and bad. You're still being taught to suppress certain emotions. It's still taboo to completely go into how you're feeling or allowing things to affect you, or even the nature in which people discipline their sons. Sons are disciplined a lot more harshly in society in nearly every culture across the board than daughters in some aspects. In some aspects, sons can be coddled, but in other aspects relating to discipline, sons are giving the harsher punishment.
Thank you, Tanaya. LJ, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, right, slower in my head. Yeah, well, the first thing I wanted to say before I kind of moved to what the breakout group I was in kind of discussed was, is you can make the argument that as Black people we didn't necessarily move away from these things. We were kind of stripped of it, right? Like, you know, one thing about the conditions of Africans when they were captured and enslaved and kind of brought on these different countries and brought here and brought to the West Indies and all these different places was, um, our ancestors were stripped and robbed of religion and a lot of the normal cultural practices, and stripped of names, right? Given all these like white and whitewashed names and religion, given a Bible, and a lot of that stuff persists today. So I was just thinking like, unfortunately, as the sisters as descendants of Africans today in this country, we've just been stripped of it. It's not necessarily that we moved away from it, but we never even had it, right? Like, we never even had it, man. So anyway, so in our group, we kind of talked about the sense of community. One thing that's kind of that we've lost as descendants of Africans is with the definition is the sense of community, a more neutralized sense of it. It's a more neutralized sense of the meaning of manhood. And then personally, I kind of talked about how today a narrative has been created that dictates what manhood is. So it depends on who you are and where you at. If you grew up in the hood, you got the homies, you got the homies on the block, you got certain individuals or group of individuals that's kind of they kind of dictate and tell you what it means to be a man, what manhood looks like. Not being a punk, there's certain words you can't say to another man, and so forth and so on. With the second question, yes and no. Um, some of the stuff of African manhood can apply to today's society, um, such as continuing to learn and honor our elders. Unfortunately, that's kind of like a lost art these days. You know, especially with the young generation, we can tend to be very disrespectful to our elders, which is sad. And I don't even know how we got to that point. But that's a discussion for another time. Um, we kind of in our group we kind of discussed how some of the practices mentioned with African manhood are kind of outdated. So it's kind of reference to like being a warrior, and kind of farming and stuff like that. A lot of us we kind of live more in a more civilized settings today in the city, so uh, some of that wouldn't necessarily apply to us, especially like being a warrior. We can be, I guess, today, we can be a warrior like from within. We can kind of, embody what it means to be a warrior. But obviously, in pre-colonial Africa, they were real warriors. You know what I mean? So, and then with there's also a regard as toughness being equivalent to taking pain, and obviously there can be varying various ways of kind of articulating that. Like can you still be a man and not necessarily take some of the pain and toughness that was kind of described in the reading? Like, I thought the circumcision one was, I thought that was a tough one.
Yeah, man.
The idea that you gotta take a circumcision without flinching, man. I don't know.
I'm
That kind
crying,
of.
bro. Fuck that shit. I'm gonna cry. Like,
Yeah, I don't know, man. Hey, all power to the ones that was able to do it, right?
real.
And then with the last one, and so with the last question presented, in pre-colonial African culture, it talked about the phases that boys went through to become men, and obviously, that was something that was new to a lot of us. I know me personally, I've heard about it. I've heard about like different cultural practices, becoming a man. And if you think about it, in most people of culture, you know what I mean? Like there's different practices that kind of, transitions, boys to men, even with women. I know growing up in my community in South Central, I was always a fan of the quinceañeras, you know what I mean? So I always got a kick out of going, because that's like a transition for the girl to the woman. And, but, growing up, you see those all the time. You don't really put much thought into it, but it's a cultural practice. And most people of culture, what I'm saying, that's the case. There is a transition phase. And, again, unfortunately for Black people, in this country, a lot of that has just been kind of robbed and stripped of it. And so it's in readings and in these spaces where we can kind of reconnect and have an understanding that we do come from a value system. We come from a people of great culture and valor and esteem. So
Thank you, LJ. Thank you, tonight. Well said. I'm gonna move forward just for sake of time. I'm gonna move through my notes because I have like 3 pages of notes. I might not get through all of them, but I'll try to get to the ones that really stand out or are most important. So, as mentioned, and as you know from our breakout room conversations, right? Manhood was a socially owned concept, right? The community possessed the right to determine who is a man and who is not a man, right? And if you did not fit within the criteria of, as the community understood it, as what a man was, then you would not fall within that category. We know that the steps to determine manhood um, were the four processes, right? Boyhood, rites of passage, demonstration of physical prowess, husbandhood, and fatherhood. But ultimately, this notion of manhood, it tied males to the ability to support others, right? And whether that be their family unit or their fellow brothers or whatever the case may be, it's about being able to be a support system for those within the community. Um, Rites of passage, right? This is the first stage of coming into manhood. They're highly symbolic, ritualized ceremonies that sought to introduce boys to male behavior, male social roles, and male-centered camaraderie. That are various aspects of manhood, right? So the first rites of passage happened shortly after birth. It was a ceremony to celebrate the birth of the child. Um, the second one became happens between the ages of 2 and 7, um, and then the third one typically happened between the ages of 9 and 13. So during stage 3, the young men became steeped in the history of their culture and their cultural uniqueness, right, in their history of their people. By age 13, um, African boys had experienced a sense of initiations whereby they were embraced and affirmed by other men in their community. So, a part of that initiation process, part of that ritual rites of passage process, was to steep the young men in the idea of being loved, nurtured, and cared for by other men in the community. So, where that idea is not foreign, right? That is like a built in process of affirmation for these young men. Um, a men's okay. So the demonstration of male prowess, right, the ability to physically impose your will on another, this was done so that observers could see that the young men had the ability to protect and provide for their family, right? So if you weren't able to physically demonstrate your prowess, if you weren't able to out wrestle somebody, right, to show your strength, many in the community wouldn't feel comfortable allowing you to marry their daughters because they felt that you could not protect their daughters, right? So a lot of these criterias had very real practical applications, okay? But then with this, what I love what the author does, right? He kind of places the proper context on this idea of physical prowess, right? He's saying that it's not to this physical prowess did not get so pervasive that men try to support the authority of other men, right? That's not what the physical prowess was about. It says theoretically, a male's goal was never to prove his physical might at the expense of his brother's well-being, right? So it wasn't about trying to clown someone else and showing that you're stronger than them or anything of that nature. They respected the hierarchy within the male classifications, right? So if somebody was older than you, you're not going to try to wrestle them just to show them up. You're going to respect their age authority over you, right? Another way that they were able to demonstrate their physical prowess was through dance, right? And a lot of the dance movements that were exhibited during this time mimicked movements of war. And it goes in the article, they talk about how a lot of the Zulu fighters that were trained under Shaka were forced to dance for hours to help them prepare and get the endurance that would be able to assist them in the battlefield. In fact, there's a brother from Zimbabwe who's doing his master's at Cal State LA right now. His name is Prince Gumbi. We used to have these men's meet in San Bernardino, and he was saying that in pre-colonial West Africa, in pre-colonial Africa, he's from South Africa, he's from Zimbabwe, but as history would have it, the concept of tribal wars that we're so entrenched in the West, right? Every time they talk about Africa, they talk about these tribal wars. He was saying prior to the European, if they were tribal wars, there would be no actual physical combat. There would be dance battles in a sense, right? So you would dance to demonstrate your physical prowess, and whoever was able to show the most endurance in the dance battle would win the battle, right? Um, so this idea when it comes to husbandhood, and this is something that I always echo to the young men who I put through rites of passage, is this idea that courage is shown on the battlefield, not in the household, right? So they have an institution set in place that will prevent physical spousal abuse and things of that nature, right? And then they said also in the article, if a man was to physically harm his spouse, it would be within the right of the uncles, the brothers, the fathers to take that man out of the household and beat him severely so he could experience what it felt like to be abused, right? So there was a inbred institution that would prevent things like physical abuse. The old African proverb, I believe it was a Shanti proverb, the strength of the palm tree, which is the father, is in its branches, which is the son, right? So the work of the palm tree is the work of the father, and that the strength of the work that the father has done will be shown in its branches or in the work that the son is able to do, right? So that just speaks to the amount of love and care that went into raising these young men along with the discipline that was necessary to make sure that they are the branches that shows that the father did the right thing, right? Um, in every West African ethnic group, studies stories were found which celebrated strong, loving father-son relationships, right? So what the author is saying, as he did studies on these West African societies, there were always stories that echo very strong, loving father-son bonds within those communities. And for me, I found that very profound, especially when looking at the works of individuals like James Baldwin, right? And when he writes about his father, he writes about his father as this very pervasive energy in the home that was a terroristic force, right? And how his father commanded fear within the whole household. And I found that to be a stark contrast to the way that this author talks about the way that West African fathers interacted with their sons. Um, and then finally, I'm sorry, not finally, but there's also notion of absence does not raise a child, right? So the whole phenomenon of a father leaving the home was not an occurrence in pre-colonial West Africa, right? The only time that a father would leave the home is if the father was no longer in the physical realm. And then finally, the basis of male leadership was more the art of oratory and argumentation than physical achievement, right? So your ability to lead people as a man was really not more so based on your ability to physically impose your will, but your ability to orate, your ability to articulate rational thought, right, and your ability to debate. So the oral tradition, as it pertains to your role as a leader, became of highest importance over your physical or your ability to impose your physical will. So those are my notes for the reading. We'll move from here into our fishbowl. So remember, with the fishbowl, you have 2 times to fishbowl this semester. You have 1 time to pass. You could talk about your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in the breakout rooms, or you could talk about the notes that I just provided to you all. So all that's on the table. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer? So Tanaya has a volunteer. Anyone else wants to volunteer? Alexandria. One more. Okay, got you. We'll get both Ryan and Markeisha. Okay. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
Okay. Can I start it off?
Yep.
Okay. So there were 2 things that mostly stood out to me during the reading that I was able to write down in my notes. One of them was the emphasis of community and having your sons be one with the men in the community. It just goes back to the teaching that it takes a village to raise a child. You weren't just expected to be raised by the people in your home, you were expected to be raised. Your elders were everyone who lived around you, the in, the entire generation of people that lived around you. So I just found that very intriguing. And the second thing I found intriguing was there was an expectation to endure pain without expression. And I think, there's that positive and that negative aspect that I was able to fully see, because present day, as we're learning more about the history of African people before enslavement, people don't like talking about the negative because we're already perceived in a negative light. But in order to have a full scope of what was and what we can move towards as a community, we have to know the negative. We have to know where aggression comes from, and if it was something that existed before enslavement, or if it was something that we actually need to work on as a community that separates from enslavement, that has no correlation to that its own individual problem actually within our community that we have to deal with on our own. We can't blame on someone else. So those 2 things were just very, very important to me as I was reading.
I have some comments, but I'm gonna say my comments at the end. So whoever's next.
I can go. This is Alex or Alexandria. So in my notes, I kind of was really interested on how the transition to manhood has really altered over the span of time. I know, like, obviously we're talking about traditional West African societies putting an emphasis on, strength, fatherhood, manhood, all the rites of passages. And I thought it was really interesting that today we were talking about this in our group as well, that we actually we encourage, gender equality, transparency, and even showing your emotions at times where I know someone earlier said that we're still harsh on men, but when we look at the traditional, like where you can't cry through a circumcision, whereas now it's like, oh, express your emotion, that's good, and that's being rewarded. So I thought it was really interesting to look at the transition of what manhood has become. I was kind of asking myself, what does the transition into manhood look like today? And it's, I think, something that's very, very loosely defined, and it's almost something that it's not a community decision. It may be like a family or even just an individual decision. So those were kind of my thoughts through the reading.
Thank you, Alexandra. We have Ryan, Markeisha next. Whoever is next is on you. You're on mute, sis.
I'm sorry. Something that I put in my journal and also we kind of talked about was basically how pre-colonial, they were shunned and cautioned that one man can't build a town. And that really stood out to me because I feel like nowadays a lot of men, especially Black men, they boast about their wealth. It's very embedded in social media and kind of like our culture today. Like you have this, you have that. um, and pre-colonial, that didn't matter. It was all about like strength and things that what can you do for the family and the community, not just like what can feed your ego. um, and I wish that we could turn more on that. Also, just like, not saying that there aren't great Black fathers out there, because there definitely is, and involved in their sons and their child's lives, but I feel like it was just more like prevalent back in the day. And you reap they reap the benefits culturally and through the lineage, versus today. Like I mean, I don't even know my lineage. My brothers couldn't do that, and that was part of their practice of like knowing everybody in their family back in the day and saying what they were doing and what they did. um and also, just one more thing, it's just like the brotherhood. There's definitely brotherhood today, but I feel like it's more different. I feel like it's just kind of like, um what can we all go out and do. It's not so much about like that networking and um, that close knit of like family togetherness. It's very like more show offy and stuff. So yeah, those are just some things that stood out to me and I really took away from the reading.
Thank you, Markeisha. Ryan, you're up next.
Hi. Um, so I wrote a few notes. I found the third rite of passage very interesting. Um, I wrote after the end of the rite, they washed away their filth in their youth, and this was on page 15. And I think this had to do with the end of the circumcision, and that was interesting to me. And it's about like perseverance and about unity and respect. And it's all around the ages 9 to 13. And I found that was interesting too, that they do skits and plays and performances. And when I was younger too, I actually really like to do like plays and stuff, except like now we're sort of like, I mean, boys like at a young age are bullied for that. And so like, but then they're talking about I wrote a paradox of gender separation, and I thought that was interesting. Yeah. And oh, I was also the book that's mentioned, Things Fall Apart. I have that book. I haven't read a lot of it, but I was wondering if you've read it or if anyone's read it.
Yeah, I mean, if you get into like, so if you say a canon, right? So like literary canon. So it's like that is like, how would we think about this? How can I articulate that for you? So English has its own canon of writers, right? So it would be like Hemingway, it would be like Shakespeare, right? And the Africana studies canon, that book Things Fall Apart is what's called a seminal text. It's like it's one of the first well-known worldwide published piece of African literature. So yeah, it's a very foundational text. Things Fall Apart. So I know Tanaya, you've done the fishbowl before, but for those who was your first time fishbowling, how did that process feel for you? Was it too difficult? Was it arduous? How was it? Pretty straightforward, right? Pretty simple. Yeah. So don't, for those who have not gone or those who are, nervous about the process, it's not that big of a deal. You just read your journal or just talk about what's talked about in your breakout rooms or talk about what I mentioned. It's really nothing to stress off of. But there's a few things that were mentioned that I want to kind of speak on before we open up to a classroom conversation for the last few moments. Tanaya makes a very profoundly interesting point that you cannot ignore or negate the negative aspects of African history, right? You have to take the good with the bad in your assessment of how to move our experience forward. Excuse me. What Tanaya is referring to is the idea or the science of dialectics, right? Dialectics is being able to view the negative and the positive of a phenomenon or of a theory and move that theory forward, right? So as scholars, you should be comfortable with this idea or this notion of dialectics, right? Markeisha was talking about how, the notion of not having a father in the home is a lot more prevalent in our world today than it was as is articulated in the reading. As a cultural studies scholar, right? I'm getting my Ph.D. in cultural studies, excuse me. You're trained to be attentive to the rupture, okay? And a rupture is a social phenomenon that happens that changes the way that something proceeds going forward, right? And if you're going to look at fatherhood and look at the rupture in fatherhood within the United States, we have to trace that back to the 1970s. Does anybody know what happens in the 1970s that removed the father from the home, especially Black and brown homes of people of culture?
It was like the war on drugs, war on crime.
That's the 80s. That's a little bit sooner. Yes, that's the second rupture, but there's a rupture that happens before that. Luis?
Wasn't there some poverty programs?
Yep. Anybody seen, y'all probably too old for this, LJ might know. Anybody seen the movie Claudine? James Earl Jones, Diane Carroll, I believe, is the female actress. So the movie Claudine is a movie that came out in the 70s about a single mom, right? She has multiple children, right? And she's receiving government assistance, right? Welfare. The caveat to welfare, and this is in the movie, but this is also in real life, right? You cannot have a man in the home to receive social welfare, right? And what would happen is the welfare workers would come to the home. If they seen a belt, if they seen a man's shoe, if they seen a tie, that would remove your ability to receive social assistance, okay? So again, being attentive to the rupture. So these social welfare programs come into play right after all of the factory jobs get removed from the urban areas. So if we are to take LA and we are to take by the railroad tracks in Central, right? All that area south of downtown used to be a lot of factories, right? And a lot of the people of culture would work at those factories. That's how they would be able to sustain themselves. Once those factories got shut down, no longer jobs were being able to be sustained. So then here comes the welfare money, right? So if there's no income being brought into the home, and you have a system that says we will support you, but you have to remove your man from the home, what are women forced to do? Keep the men out the home, right?
Be single.
Yep. So this produces this phenomenon of fathers being removed from the home, right? So back in the day, you may not have married her, right? Because you may not have the physical means to marry her, but you would still be in that home and you would still be a father. But once this rupture took place, it never was the same again. And then to Luis's point, a decade later, they came with the war on drugs, and then 3/4 of the prison population becomes people of culture, right? It's another phenomenon that removes the male from the home, right? And Marquisha was also talking about the brotherhood that you find that is kind of missing. And what's ironic, right? What's ironic is in socially deviant organizations, they replicate a lot of these criterias to manhood, okay? Socially deviant organization. One can think about gangs. Is there initiation to get into a gang? Yeah. Is there a sense of brotherhood in a gang? Yeah. To be part of the gang, don't you need to know the gang's history and their legacy? Yeah. Don't you need to know the major players in the gang? Right? I can imagine you cannot be a Crip without knowing about Raymond Williams, right? It's part of your history, right? So a lot of the things that you find within pre-colonial West African society are mimicked in these socially deviant organizations that we call gangs, right? And now I'm not saying that gangs don't have their faults, right? But again, if we are losing dialectics, I cannot ignore the positive aspects of gang activity as well, right? From a standpoint of manhood. Okay, so we have a very, very short shit. Really, we're out of time. I do want to hear a few comments for those who have not spoken today about the readings. So if you haven't said anything, I would love to hear from you. Liz, go ahead.
I like to have an input about the war on drugs. It was really more of the war on people of culture. Um, so hearing about the welfare program in the 1970s, it makes it make sense now because of all these single moms or single parents. It's just a system trying to separate the unity of brothers and sisters. And it's just clear to me now how it does work, because the prison system has the high percentage of men, and it's cultured men. Why? Because they incarcerate them. They not only don't help them seek a second opportunity into society, so the only way back is inside the jail system.
Very true. And I was looking at the chat. LJ said it's similar to Section 8, and you're absolutely right. The Section 8 functions in the same way. If you have a man in the home, you won't receive those benefits. Luis?
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's gotten even worse now because, after the cities have been disindustrialized, after we've had welfare programs, recently they've been cut by past administrations. I mean, Clinton said that he said the era of big government is over, and he left it to the states, and the states have, cut those programs. So they've cut the only source of income that's reliable.
So true. So we'll call it a day there.